Thank you all for joining us. My name is Desmond Mantle. I'm a second-year student at Stanford Law School. I'm also an alumnus of Claremont McKenna. I was class of 2023, technically graduated back in winter of 2022. I'm very excited to be introducing you all to this event. I'm focused on constitutional law, so I have to admit to a great deal of personal interest in this subject. But I'm particularly excited to be discussing this with the two esteemed CMC professors we have with us, Ioannis Evrigenis and Charles Kesler. These two professors have worked extensively on this type of subject, and of course, we all know we're here to talk about the impact of the 2024 election. So I think we'll want to get into this fairly quickly. We don't want attendees to shy away from asking challenging questions. Please keep yourselves muted, ask questions in the chat, and don't shy away from asking questions that are going to be challenging or that really get to the meat of the issues. But of course, these issues are both significant and divisive, so we ask that you remain muted throughout the program, that your questions be as succinct as possible, and that you exercise patience as we get through what I expect to be a long list of audience questions about this subject. We'll try our best to make sure we address as many different issues as we can, but it may take us some time, so please be patient in that process. So to start off, I'd want to ask our guests a couple of questions each, and I'll start by turning to Professor Kesler. Professor Kesler, you've written extensively about President Trump and about his campaign, and the 2024 election gave him not only the presidency, but also more than a 2 million vote lead over Kamala Harris in the popular vote. It also gave him, of course, Republican control of both houses of Congress. Do these results give President Trump and Republicans a Democratic mandate to govern, or do they reflect more frustration with the Democratic Party as opposed to affirmative support for Republicans?
Well, thank you, Desmond. It's a pleasure to be here today. This is the afternoon in California. I don't know what time it is in all of the squares where people are on the screen, but at any rate, he had a Republican Congress when he was first elected in 2016, so it's not unprecedented. I suppose you might say it certainly seems to amount to a larger vote of approval than he had before, because he didn't have a plurality of the vote, of the popular vote before. He didn't have quite as many electoral votes either as he did this time. And so it's more of an endorsement certainly for him, and he's more of a known quantity than he was in 2016. I'm a little unpersuaded by most appeals to presidential mandates, because our system doesn't really operate in a parliamentary way, and in a parliamentary system, the president or the prime minister is elected by the parliament, and so he has a direct mandate of a sort from the legislative vote, and we don't have that feature in our presidential system. So the vote for president is connected in some way to the vote for the legislature, but not organically or not, constitutionally. So I would say he has something like a mandate, certainly more of a mandate than he did before. And he is, with Grover Cleveland, the only president to have come back from losing an election to winning his second term non-consecutively. So that makes it, if not a mandate, at least a curiosity.
Well, thank you for that response, and we'll definitely want to dive back into some of those principles that you mentioned as we get on with the event. But turning over to Professor Evrigenis, do you have, we've got quite a bit of research that's historical in nature that looks to societies that embraced certain political models. In particular, they face certain situations, war, famine, whatever else might prompt a certain political culture to emerge. Do you have a sense of what's causing President Trump's cult of personality, his massive support across American society? Do you have any predictions for the future based on whether those motivations are going to continue or whether they might not?
Thank you as well for having me. I'm delighted to be here. one of the first things you learn in advanced political science classes taught by sane people is that you refrain from making predictions. So let me start with the appeal. I think that there seems to be a widespread agreement that economic issues drove the election. I'm in no position to challenge that, but I want to add the cultural dimension. I think that cultural issues played a very important role. And in this particular case, there was a convergence between the incumbent party being blamed for the economic results and the differences in cultural attitudes. In his first campaign and throughout his first presidency, Trump introduced something of a new way of doing things, deviating from very well-established norms or very widely accepted norms. And among these, I'm thinking of things like the way in which he addressed people with whom he was in conversation, the kinds of things that were deemed acceptable or unacceptable under different circumstances changed. I think that that approach as a whole has appealed to a lot of people. And that as the foundation throughout that first campaign and the first term, and in light of what happened during the Biden presidency, provided the groundwork upon which to then begin to attack ideas that he saw as stemming from the sort of establishment, the deep state, and so on. And so I think that ever increasing as time goes by, American individualism and an emphasis in self-determination, and I mean this down to the individual level, makes that kind of attitude quite appealing. And so I think it's a convergence of those factors. And so one of the things that I'd be looking for in thinking about the future would be what sorts of cultural consequences these kinds of developments have. How do they change the way that we talk to one another? How do they change the way in which we think about politics and conduct politics?
Well, thank you so much for that. I think those two questions both got to some stuff that's a little bit easier to answer. I have now some stuff that's a little bit more challenging in some ways, and it kind of gets to some of the heart of the divisiveness here. Professor Kesler, some concerns have been raised about whether Trump represents conservative values or is a conservative at all. There's a lot of dissent within the ranks of the Republican Party over issues like skilled worker visas, Trump's effort to rename certain geographic features, so things like Mount McKinley, Gulf of America, and also the nomenclature to refer to the events of January 6th, 2021, or other incidents like that. Is Trump's reelection a good thing for conservatism? And are the future of conservatism and the future of Trumpism different or the same?
That's a good question and multi-part question, really. I think that Trump calls himself a conservative. He calls himself a nationalist. He doesn't actually, that I've ever seen, call himself a populist. That's a word he doesn't use. But he does call himself a common sense conservative. And what he means by that, I think, is that he's not, to use another word that occasionally or term that he points to, he's not a movement conservative. He didn't come up, he's not like Ronald Reagan. He wasn't marinated in the conservative movement for decades. He didn't, his political consciousness was not formed by the conservative movement, by National Review, or by Bill Buckley, or by any of the sort of political spokesman for the conservative coalition. But he is a kind of conservative. I would say, in certain respects, he reminds me of Nixon. Nixon was an establishment, although a West Coast Republican, he was a kind of mainstream Eisenhower Republican. He was Eisenhower's vice president. But Nixon, who, like Trump, ran 3 times, was nominated 3 times for his party's presidential position. But although Nixon ran in 1960, he lost, and then again in 68 and 72, and he won, of course. which is different from Trump, who was nominated 3 times in a row, which is really quite unusual in American politics. But in 68 and 72, when Nixon took office, there was a great deal of worry that the center was not going to hold, that the new left was sort of whipsawing American politics in the 60s, and the sort of George Wallace populist right, nominally Democratic in those days, Democratic Party, I mean, it was part of that same whipsaw, left-right whipsaw that the mainstream was undergoing. And Nixon's most important conservative function was to show that the center could hold, and that a new Republican coalition, not as new as the one that Reagan would nominate in 1980, but still on the road to that new conservative Republican coalition, that it was viable, that it could win elections, and that it could begin to change the political future of the country. I think something like that is also the fate or the destiny of President Trump. He has, in a way, been forced to redefine what conservatism means in a very different age. I mean, we're not in the Cold War anymore. And from a certain point of view, that was the largest political cause in the 1950s and 1960s, even the 1970s and into the 1980s. And it affected many things, not just foreign policy. It affected domestic policy profoundly. That Cold War is over now. And so the order in the world is different, and America has to respond to those differences. And the issues in politics are different too. The sort of shift in the class basis of the two politics is really quite remarkable in the last 10 years. I mean, the Republicans are becoming, if they're not already, a working class party, and the Democrats are much less a working class party, much more an upper class party than they used to be. Trump didn't create, I think, that transition. He didn't. It's not his. He didn't cause it, but he took advantage of it, and he did further it, I think. And so, as the kind of conservative he is not very much at all like Ronald Reagan, or at least not in any large sense like Ronald Reagan. But I think it is a genuinely new conservatism, which is fitted for this post-Cold War moment, and this moment of great economic uncertainty too, of course.
So turning that sort of back around, you mentioned taking advantage of the fact that Republicans in general are now a more working class party than they have been previously. That there's a greater image of elite status on the Democratic side. I'm curious, turning that around to Professor Evrigenis, do you find that makes Trump a populist? And whether or not it does that mean that there's any credence to some of the criticisms he gets about being a threat to democracy, or an authoritarian, or perhaps a narcissist, any of those terms that are leveled at him?
So there's an increased attention to public opinion, which, like the phenomena that Professor Kesler described, are not due to Trump, but happen to coincide with the time that we live in. Politics is guided too much by polling, and now by the ability of people to comment on social media, to post news stories and opinion pieces all the time. And so it's a much more responsive landscape than it was designed to be. And so there's a broader question here, which is that something that was intended, and is that something that we want? Within that landscape, I think beyond any doubt, however one feels about Trump, he's shown that he's a master at reading this type of communication, at manipulating this type of communication, and at being able to divert attention and do other things within that framework to achieve his goals. Is this populist? I mean, as Professor Kesler pointed out, he doesn't call himself a populist. I personally have a problem with the term because I can never understand what people mean when they talk about it. There are certainly people who identify themselves as populists in Europe, for example, that share some common characteristics with Trump, but the similarity ends there. And there have been movements that appeal to the nation or the people or the right version of the people in almost any country throughout history, including in the United States. And so I don't know what the addition of the populist label adds to my understanding of the situation. That's me. I'm open to persuasion. In terms of authoritarianism, I mean, I want to be a little measured in my assessment of the situation, not least because it seems to be changing every 15 minutes. I understand that there's concern. So the sober assessment would be, I think, that if you review not just the recent history, but the long-term history of the United States and pretty much any democratic republic, you will see a lot of that going on, sometimes more intensely and sometimes less so. But the founders understood that this is part and parcel of politics, that the president is going to try to become a king, just to exaggerate slightly, and that the idea behind checks and balances is that the system will be kept running by the other branches. So that's sort of the more sober assessment of what is going on. There are at the margins of this sort of approach things that appear to be pushing the limits a little too much. And so I understand that people are becoming uncomfortable by some of the things that are being done. I don't want to go quite yet to the point where I would characterize those as authoritarian or threats to democracy necessarily. And I think that spirits were running so high during the first term, during the Biden term, and during the campaign for this term, that it's understandable that people who absolutely did not want to see Trump in power feel that this is a terrible development and that it's possibly threatening to the very core of America. But I'm not ready to go there yet. I'm watching the various developments closely. I am concerned about some of them, but if you observe politics in pretty much any similar state, you're going to see that this type of thing happens all the time, that the executive is challenging the judiciary, is pushing the limits of the interpretation of the Constitution, and trying to see where it can assert itself more strongly.
Well, thank you for that answer. I think going back to the earlier part about perhaps the word populist being a little unhelpful, that poses a great tie-in to a question we've been asked in the audience about whether Trump's tariffs find support among the same educational demographic that voted for him in 2024. And so I'd kind of like to expand that question a little bit, which is just, how much do his policies generally tend to draw support on the issue of the policy itself? Separately from Trump's identity and the ways in which people sort of support him as a person and as a symbol. And Professor Kesler, I'd like to start with you for that.
Well, look, especially in his first campaign back in 2016, Trump was not what would you say, a policy-heavy presidential candidate. I mean, his policies seemed very improvisational at that time. I think there's still maybe more improvisation in them than a lot of people would like, but I think they're much less improvisational, much more thought out now than they were in 2016. I mean, he's had a long time, he's had a whole term off, as it were, to think of to think of the direction he wants to urge on the country, and to meet the people and sort of examine their ideas that he wants to incorporate into his administration. I mean, in 2016, he really didn't know many people in Washington. He didn't know many people in policy, in politics in America. I mean, he knew a lot of people in New York, and he knew some people in Washington that he had worked with, doing deals with of one kind or another over the years. But he really didn't know the party systems very well. He didn't know the rhythms of American politics very well. He's much better at that now. I don't know that I'm not going to disagree with my colleague because he's been very moderate, as I would expect, in his reading of the administration. It is the Biden administration sounded the alarm quite loudly and quite persistently over Mr. Trump's so-called authoritarianism and his threat to democracy. President Biden called him, a semi-fascist. Kamala Harris called him, I think, a fascist outright back in October. If that's what he is, or if that's what people are worried about, there's no mistake. That issue was raised. That issue was ventilated. It was discussed widely in the country. And the thing is, the people in the election rejected that reading of him, unless you think that the people are so foolish as not to recognize what direction this president wishes to move in, and what the issues were on which he campaigned. But this is his third campaign. I mean, they've seen a lot of Donald Trump. I think they understand what they were getting when they voted for Donald Trump, and they didn't vote for a fascist. They didn't vote for an authoritarian or a threat to democracy. They voted for a big departure in democratic politics in America, certainly in the policies that he's going to try to enact, but they didn't vote against democracy. And this is the first election in a long time whose results have not been challenged in public opinion. I mean, I think we've sort of lost track of that. The Democratic resistance, and they made a big point of organizing a campaign of resistance throughout the first term of President Trump. And they sounded the tocsin throughout this campaign in 2024. And yet, despite their best efforts, the country rejected the arguments, fairly decisively. The gains that Trump made among Hispanic voters, among even Black voters, are remarkable and may be lasting. The gains he made among the working class, we've already alluded to more generally, are very remarkable. And those are not, it seems to me, the standard kind of evidence for that one would expect from a threat to democracy or a cagey authoritarian.
Professor Evrigenis, your response, especially again on the issue of sort of personality versus policy here, but if you have any responses as well to some of the stuff in sort of the second half of Professor Kesler's response there.
Yeah, so let me start with the latter, because Professor Kesler is making an important point. For better or worse, the Democrats bet heavily on attacking Trump personally, and on this narrative of fascism, authoritarianism, and threat to democracy. I find it interesting and ironic in the sense that regardless of how one feels about this, it was pretty palpable in many places in the country that people were feeling that coming from the Democrats for the past few years. And by that, I mean that there's been this widespread sense in various circles that it's more difficult to speak your mind. You might get canceled, you might get criticized. So without assessing the truth or falsity of these statements, what I'm interested in is the fact that this was there, it was visible, and they made a decision which was rather to focus on a lot of policy issues, to focus solely on Trump and his personality and the potential threat that he poses for the US. And as Professor Kesler points out, he was soundly defeated. They were soundly defeated in doing that. Now, because I take a very long-term perspective, I never rule out the possibility that people might actually want to vote for a fascist. And so I'm not gonna entertain you with a piety that it's impossible for a fascist to get elected in the United States. This is what the Germans thought of themselves in the 30s, and this is what the Italians thought of themselves in the 30s as people too enlightened to commit this kind of mistake. So I don't think that that's what's going on, but I also want to put it on the table that we should be taking a broader perspective here and not ruling things out just because they don't fit the last 30, 40, 50, 100 years. I want to go back to something that you began the question with, which is the question of the tariffs. What I see is there's on the one hand, the substantive issues regarding any particular debate, in this case, the tariffs. And then there's people's impressions of what is involved in something like the tariffs and what symbolic value the tariffs might have. And in this sense, the tariffs are unsurprising because, first of all, he wasn't very shy about it in his first term and during the campaign. But also because it fits very well with this idea that you can take action, you can take unilateral action, you can punish people for perceived wrongs. And so I think that setting aside the economic dimension of the tariffs, where there seems to be a very widespread agreement among economists that tariffs are a bad idea, but setting that aside, one needs to separately assess the rhetorical value of the tariffs and the optics of the tariffs. And I think the optics of the tariffs fit very well with this persona that he's promoting, which is that he's righting wrongs. He's able to take matters into his own hand, and he can do so unilaterally rather than as a member of international organizations or what have you.
Well, thank you for that response. We have a question that's been pending for a while in the chat about the differences from a parliamentary system, the fact that, we don't have quite the same mandate to govern that, a parliamentary government would here in a presidential system like the United States. So beginning with you, Professor Evrigenis, could you indicate, do you think Trump has a mandate to govern? I didn't really ask you that. I just sort of saved that for Professor Kesler. So do you think Trump has a mandate to govern? If so, why or why not? And then I'll turn to Professor Kesler for the response to that.
So he absolutely has a mandate to govern because our system says that when you win the Electoral College, you have a mandate to govern. I'm actually quite alarmed by the extent to which we've moved away from the institutions and towards the polls. I find that very problematic because essentially there's a wisdom in the understanding that elections cannot be called too often. Because it takes time to absorb reality, it takes time to assess the situation, and it takes time to come to a reasoned decision about things. That cannot happen at the flip of a coin or on a dime as a decision is made from one day to the next. And so the mandate is there in the sense that I think matters, which is that people voted, people accepted the result. There's been a peaceful transition of power. Now, if someone wants to say, if you win the popular vote, this gives you an extra mandate, I would refer them to earlier elections in this century where people on the other side were upset about the fact that somebody on, the situation was reversed, let's say. And so if you invoke conditions that are not part of the system, then I'm not sure what you're saying. Anybody could take a subset of the vote and say, I won this subset of the vote, and therefore this makes me the legitimate winner of the election. So yes, there is a mandate, but there's also a mandate in another way, which is that precisely this is someone who is known. What is happening is not a surprise. There was a lost election in between the two won elections, and therefore you can't really say that we were surprised. You can't really say that things are happening that we did not expect. And it appears that a majority of the American people want this type of policy.
Professor Kesler, your response.
Well, we talked a little bit about the mandate already. Let me say something about tariffs as an example of this. I mean, I think the tariff question is one on which I'm somewhat skeptical. I mean, I learned my economics from Milton Friedman, as did other people of my generation. And he, like other classical economists and Nobel Prize-winning economists in those days, was extremely skeptical of tariffs. But I have to tell you that high tariffs is not just Mr. Trump's idiosyncrasy. It actually is the historical position of the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party was a high tariff party in Abraham Lincoln's time, and ever since, up until Herbert Hoover, at least, was crushed in 1932 in that election. And there was a good political economic argument in favor of high tariffs back in those days. It was a way to make sure that American workers could enjoy what they used to call an American standard of living, and not, as we might say today, a third world standard of living. American labor didn't have to compete directly with wage levels and the lack of social legislation and working protections in many other parts of the world, low producing parts of the world. But could live the American dream to American economic and political and health and other kinds of standards. So Trump is, in a way, you could say, if you look at this strategically, he's trying to move the Republican Party back to its pre-Cold War set of economic nostrums and its set of economic analyses. I'm not sure that will work, but it's not incoherent. It's not unprecedented. It's not it's not a fly-by-night economic program. It's nonetheless, of course, the way he is implementing it is rather touch and go. And as so much else in his administration, it is touched by his own a bull in a china shop sort of approach to opposition and to negotiations. But I don't, and I think the American people understood that tariffs was a part of a mandate. It was part of the platform on which he competed and which he endorsed. Whether they expected all that has unfolded so far and so rapidly in the first month or so, or 2 months now of his term, I don't know. But that's part of the problem with the definition of a mandate. It's not clear, what the mandate is never specific enough to match the circumstances of politics and policy that are going to confront a new president. And so there's always some slippage between the mandate and the actions of the president. But on tariffs, I mean, he didn't disguise his affection for tariffs and his desire to embrace it as the leading characteristic almost of his economic policy.
Well, thank you for those answers. Before we get into a couple of excellent questions about the constitutional limits on power and sort of constitutionality of a variety of actions, I do want to get a preliminary question out of the way, something that I've been asked by an audience member, which is what each of you think the likelihood was or possibility was of tampering with this 2024 election, whether you think that the landslide results reflect that possibility or not, and if you might compare, sort of the alleged influence of, Dominion voting or these other, theories that existed out about the 2020 election with now, for example, the questioner asks about Trump's cozy relationship with Russia and certain tech companies. Beginning with you, Professor Evrigenis, do you think there's any evidence of sufficient irregularities to have changed the outcome of this election?
So the short answer is no. And for a moment, I want to go back to the question of tariffs. I think it's worth returning to the distinction that I drew earlier between the actual policy and the rhetorical value or the signaling value of invoking them. I think that one big pathology of the U.S. Today is that we're suffering from the greatest period of peace and prosperity that has ever been experienced. So people are taking things for granted that they don't really understand. And so I think that when he speaks about tariffs and how he describes them, people's hearing ceases with we're going to make a lot of money out of this. We're going to tax other people and we're not going to tax ourselves. So there's wishful thinking there. And I think this played a depressingly large role in how tariffs played out here. But I want to use the tariff issue for a second to jump onto a bigger problem, which I think is the really worrying issue here. He seems to be largely uninterested in and not have a very good understanding of foreign policy. And in the way in which he has been acting, so a charitable reading of the way in which he has been acting goes back to an old idea in political thought, which is that you kind of shake things up a little bit so that people don't really know what to expect. And so you could say that to the extent that he's doing this on purpose, he's doing it because he wants to show them who's boss. He wants to show them that they can't really rely on things and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we've witnessed some pretty striking things. I'll just mention two. One was the encounter in the Oval Office with Zelensky about 10 days ago, which was frankly shocking. And it was shocking because what happened during that encounter was a public version of something that typically happens in private. So those of you who remember your Thucydides describes a notorious episode where the Athenians are fighting the Melians, who are much weaker. And the way the Athenians begin their discussion is, because we're having this discussion behind closed doors, in other words, we're not speaking in front of an audience, we're going to spare you the bullshit. And so we'll get right to the point. And the point they're making is the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Now, we know that this is how politics is conducted, but to come out and show everyone in public, for me, changes the rules of the game. So that's one thing. Then the second thing that I would point to is that the United States completely inexplicably has ceased to do countermeasures in cyber warfare towards Russia. There is no conceivable foreign policy that I can think of in which this would be a sane move. So I think that we need to put whatever is happening in the domestic sphere in the grand scheme of things. And so while tariffs in the short run may make you some money, we all know that this doesn't end there, right? There are consequences, and the consequences are being played out for people who weren't interested before, didn't understand them before. They now realize how, for example, the automobile industry works, or produce, and those types of things. So I think international relations, foreign policy needs to be a big part of this assessment.
Well, thank you. So Professor Kesler, I guess that kind of leaves you with two questions to respond to. The first is just, do you see any evidence of sufficient irregularities to have affected the outcome? And the second would be, what do you make of the relationship with Russia that the United States now seems to be charting?
Well, I would say no, I don't see any looming any evidence of irregularities or of a looming investigation into or search for such irregularities. But then I was never persuaded that the 2020 election had been stolen either. I mean, I think Trump persuaded himself that that was the case, but it seems to me that is highly unlikely, regardless of how many people now agree with him or say they agree with him on that subject. No, I don't see parallel worries about the 2024 election. Thank goodness. I mean, I think we had enough of not only the Russia collusion episode, which really dominated several years worth of the first term of Mr. Trump, and before that, of course, there was the Bush, George W. Bush election of 2000 and other elections recently in which the losing party has questioned the legitimacy of the contest and of the count. As far as Russia goes, these two subjects do overlap because of the Russia collusion story from 2016, I guess. I too am a little. I would certainly be disturbed by the cessation of intelligence countermeasures against Russia, if that becomes a permanent aspect of our relation with them. I don't think it will. I mean, I don't think unless Vladimir Putin and turns out to be the kind of negotiating partner that Mr. Trump is wishing for, which I doubt he does or will. I don't think that Mr. Trump will be as friendly towards Putin by the end of his term as he may have seemed to be in recent conversations with Zelensky and others about Mr. Putin and the trustworthiness of the Russians. You know, I think Trump is exaggerates, of course, for effect. And when he speaks about Putin, he is also speaking partly to Putin. And he is, he is conducting a negotiation long before the negotiation begins. So I think we should wait and see what direction the question of Ukraine moves, and what kind of an outcome we get. I am not, in one of those conservatives who's in favor of ditching Ukraine, or who believes that Russia is somehow a natural ally of the United States. And I think within the administration, although those views are represented in the foreign policy appointments he has made, the opposite of those points of view is also represented in some of those appointments, especially in below the secretary level. There are some more traditional Republican realpolitik types in this administration who will make their presence felt, I think, as the drama over Ukraine works itself out.
All right. Well, thank you both for those responses. I do want to turn over toward the constitutional questions that Trump's presidency has started to raise, and I think that's very sort of important for discussion here. Besides my personal bias in favor of that subject matter. So we've got one question from Carrie George, which is: do you think Trump's voters care that many of his actions since he became president flout or challenge the Constitution, particularly the separation of powers? Jack Lucas follows up with that, asking, isn't any president's mandate limited by the Constitution? And most recently, we've got a question from Matt McKenna to ask, the claim of a mandate seems to be used by Trump admin to justify consolidating executive power. Both parties are guilty historically of this, but what happens when Trump disregards recent Justice Department rulings and claims his executive power is the end game? Is the Constitution becoming irrelevant? When should I become concerned? So I'll start with Professor Kesler on this one. First on Carrie's question about what Trump's voters expected constitutionally, and then turning toward the Constitution sort of more normatively, what you think Trump is posing to the Constitution, and then I'll turn over to Professor Evrigenis about that as well.
Okay, thank you, Desmond. Look, I think this is This is a great question, and it opens a series of questions that we need to discuss, because this area is not, I think, well understood in public opinion. I think a lot of Trump's supporters see him counterintuitively from the point of view of the mainstream media and many analysts. They see him as a constitutionalist statesman, as someone who is trying to rescue constitutional forms and practices in our politics from the deep state, from an unconstitutional or even anti-constitutional arrangement which has grown up in a way out of the sight and very much out of the control of the public over the past 50 years, let us say. One could argue about when the administrative state began or when the deep state began. These terms are not synonymous, I think. I prefer the term the administrative state. And this administration does talk about both of those terms, including with some specificity the administrative state as well. But the breaking of norms, which has been a charge against Trump in the first term and continues to be now in his second term, I think the defense of Trump, which one saw at least in part in his two impeachment trials, the defense of that really is that the norms that he has broken have been what you might call administrative state norms. They are norms of modern American politics. They are not necessarily constitutional norms in the originalist sense of the document and of the philosophy, you might say, of government that informs that document. So whether the executive has as wide a scope for action in running his branch, the executive branch, as Mr. Trump asserts, is certainly a question both from the contemporary point of view of, how does this square with the way Biden ran the presidency, the way Obama ran his presidency, but it also raises questions about deeper questions, it seems to me. Is this closer to an originalist style assertion of executive power under Article 2, which may or may not conform to the norms of the past 20 years or 50 years of the modern state? And Mr. Trump has not made his case, his constitutional case, very strongly or very passionately, but that doesn't mean, it seems to me, that a case can't be made for much of the steps that he has taken or wants to take.
Yeah, Professor Evrigenis, your response to that?
I'd start with an observation about a tactical mistake that I think the Democrats have made in the last few years, which is to stop paying attention to lower level elections. The judiciary in this country has been transformed radically. And so one concern would be how does this transformation of the judiciary alter the balance of power between the different branches? So long, I'm very old-fashioned in this. For anybody who doesn't know, I wasn't born in the US, and so I have a very naive view of the US Constitution. I'm very fond of it. And I take very seriously the checks and balances idea. And so long as I hear even the most egregious attempts to do anything referred to the Constitution for support, I feel better. There are some things that it would be very hard to push the Constitution to do. That said, have there been violations of the law? I think that January 6th is a violation of the law. I think you'd be very hard pressed to think that it isn't. And I found it amusingly depressing when the president addressed Congress a few days ago, when he, on the one hand, promised that anybody who attacks an officer of the law is going to face the death penalty, having just pardoned 1,500 people who did precisely that. And so there are concerns about this kind of thing, but as someone pointed out in the chat, this is there have been mistakes on both sides in that regard. There's been kind of an arms race in trying to push the president's executive power or the Congress's power, depending on who's holding what at any given point. And so I return again to the basic understanding of the Constitution as an arrangement that recognizes that this is going to be part and parcel of politics. Anybody who sits in the White House is going to try to turn the US into a monarchy. Anybody who sits in the Senate is going to try to keep it an aristocracy. And so there is a lot of weight right now on the judiciary. I'm optimistic in what I'm seeing from the Supreme Court. I see the Supreme Court being much more measured than some of the worst fears that were expressed when Trump appointed the last 3 justices, that they were simply going to wave him through no matter what he does. So we've seen some resistance in that sense. And that should carry a lot of weight, that there needs to be attention paid to alleged violations of the law, and those need to be maybe prosecuted or pursued or investigated. But I would also say that it's possible to lose sight of the political significance of these. And here what I have in mind is there were a couple of times in the last few years when the Democrats paid too much attention to things that most people considered to be relatively minor. They devoted a lot of energy to them. And rhetorically and politically, this cost them. And so I understand the dilemma, because if you are somebody who swears to uphold the Constitution, should you allow any kind of illegality? Should you say that this is a small infraction or a big infraction, and therefore that I have different standards for interfering? On the other hand, if you're interested in winning elections, you have to think about the extent to which you're actually supporting or validating Trump's self-narrative, which is that the deep state is after him, and therefore that they will use the FBI, the courts, and all of the machinery to persecute him.
Thank you. I appreciate both those answers. We're, heading toward the end of time here, so we have far too many questions to get through all of them in detail. But I do think the vast majority of the remaining questions get to a couple of issues with regard to the future. So I am sorry, we will be again returning to the question of the future, maybe not demanding that you predict it, but at least asking for some thoughts about what's likely to come. On the Republican side, I think there are feelings about whether Trump's legacy is going to be one of, bringing peace to Ukraine and Russia, to the Israel-Hamas situation, and other parts of the world, or whether, this tariff stuff or other stuff that is associated with this presidency is going to supersede that in public imagination moving forward. There's also the question of what the Republicans are going to do in 2028. Flip that around on the Democrats. You've already touched on this, both of you, the fact that Democrats did not clearly have a winning strategy this time around, and questions about what might be happening moving forward for them to try to win elections again. So I'm kind of curious on both sides of that. I'll start with Professor Kesler. What do you see as the Republican Party's way forward, both with Trump's legacy and after Trump? And then if you could turn to the Democrats and express a little bit about what you think would maybe change their fortunes moving forward.
Good. Okay. Thank you again. Trump, I happen to have been studying and even teaching Andrew Jackson recently. So Trump is in some ways a very Jacksonian figure. That is, he dominates his age, not by being, a classical statesman or a brilliant rhetorician or persuading people with his dulcet words and arguments, but because he dominates the consciousness of both his friends and his enemies. He's in their head. They can't get him out of their head. And that's a tremendous advantage politically. And it's similar to, I think, the situation that Andrew Jackson, also a very imperfect human being and president, displayed and experienced in the 1820s and 30s as well. Trump is sort of the dominant political figure of the age. He's remaking the Republican Party, and he may end up remaking the Democratic Party too. I mean, people haven't noticed how much, for example, Kamala Harris changed in her own rhetoric and appeals from when she was running in 2020 as Biden's vice president to when she was speaking to the convention in 2024 as the presidential nominee of her party in her own right. In 2020, she talked about she basically introduced herself as a Black woman. She talked about structural racism. She talked about George Floyd. She talked about all of the, you might say, the most woke themes swirling around American politics at the time. Almost all of that was gone in 2024 when she presents herself as the presidential candidate proper of her party. She no longer really emphasizes either her race or her sex. She emphasizes that she is the child of two amazing immigrants who have come to the country and helped to make the country a better place, helped to make it an amazing place, the best country in the world. Structural racism as such was gone from her diagnosis of the country and its problems. Abortion was a constant. She talked about abortion in both campaigns, but it's amazing how far to the center she had moved in her self-presentation in 2024 from 2020. So it's not just that the country has had an amazing red shift in the 2024 election that elected Mr. Trump. It's the Democratic Party, or at least the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, that has also had a red shift. She's shifted to the right, to the center, from the rather, extreme left where she was hanging out in her own campaign, her own abortive campaign in 2020, and then in her race as vice president in 2020. So Trump's effects are going to be very large, I think, on the future of both parties. But, Trumpism will continue, but Trump won't be around. So that will be a challenge for the Republicans. It's not clear that anyone else can keep the support across party lines, racial lines, ethnic lines, and class lines that Trump has been able to assemble. That's not going to be easy to keep that coalition together and to make it battle worthy for many election cycles to come. After all, his control of the House, or the Republican control of the House and the Senate, is extremely narrow. And, if to the extent that people think a realignment in American politics is happening, we have to see several more electoral cycles to have evidence of that. There's just not enough evidence. The numbers themselves don't clearly express, I think, a thoroughgoing political realignment of the kind that we're familiar with in American history. We'll see whether that happens or not. I'm not persuaded that it has happened yet, but I think there's more of a case than there has been in a long time that it's going on, that we're in the midst of a kind of class and ethnic and race and political realignment in the country between the two parties. I don't know if that answers your question about the future, but it's at least a beginning to suggest what is up for grabs going forward in the political future. I would much rather be a Republican than a Democrat, I think, looking forward to the future, because the Democrats have I mean, they threw everything they possibly could at Trump in 2016, in 2020, and in 2024, and they lost 2 out of 3 of those elections. So where do they go from here? I think that is a genuine sort of existential question for the Democrats, much more than it is right now, at least for the Republicans.
Thank you so much for that answer. Final word, Professor Evrigenis, on that issue.
The future right now can be seen on the one hand through the lens of the parties and the future of the parties, and there I would agree with what my colleague said. I wanted to approach this from a different angle through something that Tom put in the chat, whether or not I feel comforted by the Supreme Court ruling in Trump v. United States. It's not that I'm comforted by any particular ruling, and the thing that it seems to me we need to get back to is take a step back from the panic of any individual action. That doesn't mean give up our diligent attention to the Constitution and to the principles of the Constitution. But spending the amount of time that we're spending, if you look at, for example, the New York Times and various other news outlets, CNN, Fox News, and so on, dissecting every single action that takes place as the precursor to authoritarianism, the end of the world, is not a productive way to go about this. I think that if we keep thinking as we do at CMC about how do you get to a place where you can have a civilized conversation, how can you think about difficult issues in a way that takes others' opinions seriously, doesn't shy away from the difficult questions, but engages them. The only way to do that is by moving ourselves away from the immediate tendency to say that there's a supreme crisis because there was a bad Supreme Court decision. There have been bad Supreme Court decisions pretty much in any presidency. I agree with you that in the sense of this decision, because it deals with a question of executive power, it seems much scarier. On the other hand, what it does is it says that the particular cases that are alleged need to be examined, and a determination has to be made about whether or not the president has actually superseded his authority or whether something constituted an official act. There are certainly scary or questionable elements in the rationale as it was given, but I think that we need to stop thinking that we're sort of on a downward slide that's going to end in disaster. I think we need some measure of optimism and some amount of goodwill. And the fact that the last 3 campaigns have been so poisoned by the rhetoric makes this very difficult. But the only way to refocus on the common good is to assume that not everything that's being done is done for personal gain or for sinister reasons. I think that cooling down the temperature is going to allow us to be more productive, and that would be my sort of recommendation for the future.
Thank you all for attending. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every single question. I do hope we at least provided some very interesting information to you. And as someone asked earlier in the session, there will be a video of this posted on YouTube, and the office will share that link once it's available if you'd like to watch it again or share it with family or friends. But thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.